Number. He left her $10 million. He left me a mission, and that was the real inheritance. When the lawyer said $10 million, my sister Vanessa practically glowed. When he turned to me and said, "Go earn your own," I felt my world shatter into 1,000 pieces. But what happened next in that mahogany-paneled office would reveal the most shocking family secret I never saw coming, and change everything I thought I knew about love, money, and what truly matters when someone dies. You see, there was a second will, and a grandfather I thought had forgotten me, and a sister who had been lying to me for years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, in that law office that smelled like leather and old wood polish, the kind of scent that made you think of handshakes and signatures that changed lives forever. I sat straight-backed in the burgundy chair, hands folded in my lap, trying to ignore the way my palms were sweating. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished conference table where 4 envelopes waited in a neat row. My sister Vanessa sat to my left, smoothing her blonde hair behind her ear with that practiced gesture she'd perfected in high school. She wore a black dress that probably cost more than my rent, and her smile had that barely contained excitement of someone who knew good news was coming. Mom and Dad flanked us like bookends, their faces set in those careful expressions they wore at funerals and graduations. They'd been unusually quiet on the drive over, which should have been my first clue that something was different about today. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking time like a metronome, and I found myself counting the seconds because it was easier than thinking about why we were here. Grandpa Walter had been gone for 3 weeks now, and this was supposed to be the final piece of business, the last chapter in a life that had stretched across 87 years. Mr. Henderson, our family lawyer, cleared his throat and reached for the first envelope. His hands were steady, professional, as he broke the seal with a silver letter opener. The paper crackled in the silence, and I watched Vanessa's posture straighten even more, if that was possible. "To my granddaughter, Vanessa Whitman," he began, his voice carrying the weight of formality that made everything feel official and irreversible. "I leave the sum of $10 million, to be transferred immediately upon the reading of this will." The words hit the room like a physical force. $10 million. I felt my breath catch in my throat, not from jealousy exactly, but from the sheer magnitude of it. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment, her composure cracked enough to show genuine surprise. "Oh my God," she whispered, and her eyes filled with tears that I wasn't sure were entirely genuine. She'd always been good at performing grief, at knowing exactly when to cry and when to smile. Mom reached over and squeezed Vanessa's shoulder, her own eyes bright with pride and relief. "Your grandfather always knew you'd take care of it properly," she said, and there was something in her voice that made my stomach clench. Dad nodded approvingly, his accountant's mind probably already calculating tax implications and investment strategies. Then they all turned to look at me. 3 pairs of eyes, waiting for my reaction, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this was it. This was my moment in the spotlight. The part where I was supposed to be gracious and supportive, and not at all bitter about the fact that my sister had just inherited enough money to buy a small country. I managed what I hoped was a smile, and said, "Congratulations, Vanessa. Grandpa always said you were his little princess." But Dad's expression didn't soften the way it usually did when we talked about Grandpa's pet names. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his fingers drumming against the table in that nervous pattern he'd had since I was a kid. "Claire," he said, and his voice was different now, cooler somehow. "Your grandfather was very specific about his wishes. He felt that you were, well, that you were capable of making your own way in the world." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire you couldn't quite locate. I felt my forehead furrow as I tried to process what he was saying, but before I could respond, Mom jumped in with that bright, false cheerfulness she used when she was trying to smooth over awkward situations. "What your father means is that Grandpa always admired your independence, sweetheart. He knew you didn't need anyone's help to succeed. So go earn your own," Dad said bluntly. And there it was, the truth, stripped of all the diplomatic packaging Mom had been trying to wrap around it. 4 words that landed like a slap, delivered with the same casual tone he might use to comment on the weather. Go earn your own. As if 26 years of being his daughter, of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and graduation ceremonies, had somehow failed to earn me a place in this family's definition of love. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or throw things or demand explanations. I just sat there, staring at the reflection of the conference room lights in the polished table surface, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach by someone wearing brass knuckles. The silence stretched on, broken only by the tick of that damn clock and the sound of Vanessa shifting uncomfortably in her chair. That's when the man in the gray suit stood up. I hadn't really noticed him before, this elderly gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes who'd been sitting quietly in the corner throughout the reading. He cleared his throat gently, and when he spoke, his voice carried a warmth that cut through the chill that had settled over the room. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but there's one more document." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with red wax. My name was written across the front in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting, the same careful script he'd used to label mason jars in his workshop and write notes in the margins of his science journals. "For Claire," the envelope read, "when she's ready to understand." Mom's smile faltered. Dad's fingers stopped drumming. Vanessa's head snapped up, and for the first time since we'd walked into this office, she looked uncertain. The man in the gray suit introduced himself as Harold Keene, and he explained that he'd been Grandpa's research partner for over 40 years. He'd been instructed to deliver this envelope only if the family reading went exactly as it had. "Walter was very specific about the circumstances," Mr. Keene said, his eyes meeting mine across the table. "He wanted to be sure that certain truths came to light at the proper time." The envelope felt heavier than it should have when he placed it in my hands. The wax seal bore the impression of a honeybee, the same symbol Grandpa had used to mark his most important research papers. My fingers trembled slightly as I broke the seal, and I was aware of everyone watching me, waiting to see what other surprises this day might hold. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a smaller envelope containing a key. The paper held an address I didn't recognize, along with a brief note in Grandpa's handwriting. "The Charleston Ranch, the old horse barn at the end of Laurel Creek Road. Find your grandmother. She's been waiting for you." I looked up at the faces around me, searching for some explanation, but all I saw were carefully blank expressions and the kind of silence that comes when people are trying very hard not to say something. "I don't understand," I said finally. "Grandma's been dead for 15 years. Mr. Keene shook his head gently. "Your grandfather's first wife, your grandmother Helen, passed away 15 years ago. But Walter remarried 7 years ago to a woman named Dorothy. She's been living at the Charleston property since then." The room seemed to tilt sideways. I felt like I was looking at my family through water, everything distorted and strange. "7 years?" I managed to say. "Grandpa remarried 7 years ago, and none of you told me?" Vanessa had the grace to look ashamed, at least. She twisted her hands in her lap and wouldn't meet my eyes. "It was complicated," she said quietly. "We didn't think. We weren't sure how to. How to what?" I stood up so quickly that my chair scraped against the hardwood floor. How to tell me that our grandfather had found happiness again. How to tell me that there was someone else in his life who might have wanted to meet me. Dad's jaw tightened. "Claire, don't be dramatic. It's not like you were around much anyway. You were always so busy with your research and your travels. Because you made it clear that my work didn't matter to you," I shot back, and I was surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Because every time I tried to share what I was doing, you changed the subject or found something more important to discuss." The drive to Charleston took 2 hours, and I spent most of it in a state of numb shock. The countryside rolled past my windows like a movie I wasn't really watching. All green fields and weathered barns and the kind of rural beauty that usually made me feel peaceful. But today, everything felt surreal, like I was moving through someone else's life instead of my own. The address led me down a gravel road that seemed to go on forever, past mailboxes with names I didn't recognize, and driveways that disappeared into stands of oak trees. When I finally found the Charleston property, I almost drove past it. The house was smaller than I'd expected, a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch and flower boxes under every window. It looked like the kind of place where someone might actually be happy. I sat in my car for a long time, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. Part of me wanted to turn around and drive home, to pretend that this afternoon had never happened and that my life was still the simple, predictable thing it had been this morning. But the key in my pocket felt warm against my fingers, and I could almost hear Grandpa's voice telling me to stop being such a coward. The woman who answered the door was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes the color of summer sky. She wore a blue dress and an apron covered in flour, and when she saw me, her face went through a series of expressions that ranged from surprise to something that might have been relief. "So," she said, after a moment that stretched between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. "You must be Claire." I nodded, suddenly aware that I was still wearing the black dress I'd chosen for the will reading, still carrying the expensive purse that had seemed so important this morning. "Are you Dorothy?" She smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen all day. "I am. And you're late, honey. I've been expecting you for 3 weeks now." She led me into a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread, where afternoon light streamed through windows that looked out over fields I hadn't known existed. The walls were covered with photographs, and it took me a moment to realize that most of them were of me. Pictures from my college graduation, from the research conference in Portland last year, from the trip to Costa Rica where I'd studied sustainable farming practices, pictures that I'd never seen before, taken from angles that suggested someone had been watching me from a distance. "Walter was so proud of you," Dorothy said, following my gaze. "He kept every newspaper clipping, every research paper you published. He used to read them out loud to me over breakfast." I felt my throat tighten. I didn't know he followed my work. "Oh, honey." Dorothy's voice was gentle, but there was steel underneath it. "He tried to follow everything about your life. He called your parents every week, asking for your phone number, for your address, for any news about what you were doing. They told him you were too busy to talk, that you'd moved on from family concerns." The kitchen floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. "That's not true." "I called him. I tried to visit last Christmas, but when I got to the house, no one was there. I thought maybe he'd gone to Florida or something." Dorothy's expression darkened. "We were here, Claire. We were here all winter. Walter spent Christmas Day sitting by the phone, hoping you'd call." I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, feeling like I'd been running a marathon and had just hit the wall. "I don't understand. I had his phone number. I called it dozens of times. What number did you have?" I recited the number I'd been using for years, the one Vanessa had given me when I'd moved to Seattle for graduate school. Dorothy shook her head slowly. "That's not our number, honey. Not even close." The pieces started falling into place then, creating a picture that made me feel sick to my stomach. The phone number that was always busy or went to voicemail. The Christmas visit where no one was home. The birthday cards I'd sent that were never acknowledged. The funeral I'd almost missed because I'd gotten the time wrong. "The funeral," I said quietly. "I was told it was at noon. I got there at 11:45, and the service was already over." "It was at 9 in the morning," Dorothy said. "Walter specifically requested an early service, because he knew you weren't a morning person. He wanted to make sure you had time to say goodbye." I put my head in my hands, trying to process the magnitude of what had been done to me. My own family had systematically cut me out of Grandpa's life, had made sure that every attempt I made to connect with him failed. They'd stolen years of relationship from both of us, years that we could never get back. "Why?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Dorothy sat down across from me, her face sad but not surprised, because they knew what Walter was planning. They knew that if you two stayed close, if you kept coming around and being the granddaughter he adored, you'd inherit everything, and they couldn't let that happen. "But Vanessa got $10 million today." "That was the decoy will," Dorothy said quietly. "The one they all expected. Walter had me call Betty, Jacob, and Vanessa about an hour ago. They should be here any minute." As if summoned by her words, I heard the sound of car doors slamming in the driveway. 3 voices, getting closer to the house, and I recognized all of them. Mom's bright chatter, Dad's measured responses, Vanessa's laugh that sounded just a little too forced. They were talking about dinner plans and whether they needed to stop for gas on the way home, casual conversation that suggested they thought this day was over. Oh my goodness, Mom said as they came through the front door. "It smells exactly the same as Walter's old house. How do you do that?" "I thought this was handled already," Dad said, and I could hear the irritation in his voice. "Haven't we been through enough today?" "Seriously," Vanessa added. "This couldn't have waited until tomorrow? I have plans tonight." I stayed hidden in the kitchen, listening to them settle into what I assumed was the living room. Dorothy had called Mr. Keene while they were driving over, and he'd promised to be here within the hour. She'd also made a pot of coffee and cut slices of what looked like the best apple pie I'd ever seen, as if she were preparing for a normal family visit instead of whatever this was about to become. "Claire," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the house. "Come in here, honey. It's time." I walked into the living room on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The three of them were arranged on Dorothy's couch like they owned the place, still in their funeral clothes but somehow looking less formal now, more relaxed. The sight of them there, in this house that should have been familiar to me but wasn't, made something twist in my chest. Mom blinked when she saw me, like she'd forgotten I existed. Dad adjusted his collar, which was something he did when he was nervous. Vanessa's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "Hello," I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "I hear we have some things to discuss." Mr. Keene arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen better days and wearing the same kind expression he'd worn in the lawyer's office. He nodded to Dorothy like they were old friends, accepted a cup of coffee, and settled into the chair across from where my family sat. "Walter asked me to handle this personally," he said, opening his briefcase and withdrawing a manila envelope that was much thicker than the one I'd received earlier. He wanted to make sure that certain truths came to light, and that the real terms of his will were understood by everyone involved. He broke the seal and withdrew a document that was easily 20 pages long. "The last will and testament of Walter R. Whitman," he read, "written in sound mind and body, with full knowledge of the circumstances that necessitated this deception." The real will was nothing like the one we'd heard in the lawyer's office. Dorothy inherited the house and surrounding property, along with enough money to ensure she'd never have to worry about anything for the rest of her life. I inherited something called the Whitman Research Annex, which included all of Grandpa's laboratory equipment, his patents and research notes, and a trust fund that would support scientific research for the next 50 years. Everything else, the stocks and bonds and investment accounts that made up the bulk of Grandpa's estate, was to be divided equally between Vanessa and me. The $10 million she'd been promised in the fake will was real, but it wasn't the gift she'd thought it was. It was her half of an inheritance that should have been shared from the beginning. Vanessa's face went white, then red, then white again. "What?" she said, and her voice cracked on the word. "He gave her the lab? The whole research facility?" "I don't understand," Mom said, but her voice suggested that she understood perfectly well. "Walter told us that if Vanessa just kept visiting him, kept being the granddaughter he could count on, everything would come to her." "You told me that," Vanessa said, and suddenly she was looking at our parents with an expression I'd never seen before, something between betrayal and fury. "You told me that if I just smiled and played nice, if I brought him flowers and listened to his stories, everything would be mine." Dad's jaw tightened. "That's not exactly what we said." "It's exactly what you said," Vanessa shot back. "You made it sound like Claire had walked away from the family, like she didn't care about anyone but herself. You told me I was the only granddaughter who mattered to him." Mr. Keene cleared his throat. "There's more." Walter also wrote a personal letter to be read aloud at this time. He withdrew another sheet of paper, this one written in Grandpa's careful handwriting. The letter was addressed to me, but he read it so that everyone could hear. "My dearest Claire," he began, and I felt something inside my chest crack open. "If this letter is being read, then I'm no longer able to tell you these things in person, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but mostly I'm sorry that I wasn't strong enough to stop what was happening to you." The letter went on for several pages, describing things I'd forgotten and things I'd never known he'd noticed. He wrote about the science fair in 7th grade, where I'd won first place for a project about honeybee communication systems. He'd been the only family member to attend, and he'd watched me accept my trophy with tears in his eyes. "I saw how you clutched that little blue ribbon like it was made of gold," he wrote. I saw how you looked around the auditorium, hoping your parents would be there to see you succeed. I saw your face fall when you realized they weren't coming. He wrote about the Christmas when I was 16, when I'd shown him my acceptance letter to the summer science program at the university. How I'd asked him to hide the letter, not to mention it to anyone else. Maybe if I don't make a big deal about it, I'd said, they won't find a way to make me feel bad about it. You deserved celebration, Claire, the letter continued. You deserved parents who bragged about your accomplishments instead of treating them like embarrassments. You deserved a family who saw your brilliance as a gift, instead of a threat. He wrote about the phone calls he'd made, trying to reach me. The letters he'd sent that were returned unopened. The Christmas presents he'd bought that I'd never received. He'd known, he said, that something was wrong, but he'd been too old and too tired to fight the barriers that had been built between us. I can't give you back those lost years, the letter concluded. But I can give you something that belongs to you, something that no one else can take away or diminish. I can give you the tools to build the life you were meant to have, the life where your curiosity and your compassion can change the world. Mr. Keene folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The silence that followed was different from the silence in the lawyer's office. This one was full of truths that couldn't be taken back, of damage that couldn't be undone. I remember that science fair, I said finally, my voice steady despite the tears that were sliding down my cheeks. Mom couldn't come because she was at Vanessa's piano recital. Dad was working late. I stood on that stage, holding my trophy, and I felt like I was accepting an award for being weird. Claire, Mom started, but I held up my hand. I remember coming home and putting the trophy on my dresser, and you asked me why I couldn't just be more like my sister. You asked me why I had to be so different, so difficult to understand. I turned to look at Vanessa, who was staring at her hands. And I remember you telling me that boys don't like girls who are too smart, that I should try to be more normal if I wanted to fit in. You made me feel like there was something wrong with me for caring about science. That's not what I meant, Vanessa said quietly. Maybe not, I agreed. But that's what I heard. That's what I learned. That my interests were something to be ashamed of. That my achievements were somehow threatening to everyone around me. I stood up, suddenly needing to be in motion. Do you know what Grandpa gave me for my 18th birthday? A subscription to Scientific American and a note that said, "For the granddaughter who asks the questions no one else thinks to ask." It was the first time anyone had ever told me that my curiosity was a good thing. We supported your education, Dad said defensively. We never stopped you from studying whatever you wanted. No, I said, shaking my head. Grandpa supported my education. He paid for my college applications, my lab fees, my research trips. He's the one who encouraged me to apply for graduate school, who helped me find funding for my thesis project. You two just signed the papers when you had to. The room fell silent again. Dorothy had disappeared into the kitchen, giving us space to have this conversation without an audience. Mr. Keene was organizing his papers, pretending not to listen to what was essentially a family falling apart. I tried to love you the way you wanted to be loved, I said, looking at each of them in turn. I tried to be the daughter and sister you could be proud of. But every time I succeeded at something, every time I found joy in my work, you made me feel like I was doing something wrong. We didn't mean to make you feel that way, Mom said. And for the first time, she sounded genuinely sorry. I know, I said. But meaning and doing are different things. And what you did was make me feel like I didn't belong in this family. Like I was some kind of mistake that you had to tolerate. Vanessa looked up then, and her eyes were red with tears. Claire, I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought Grandpa just preferred me. I thought that was normal. It might have been, I said. If it had been real preference, based on personality or shared interests or just chemistry. But it wasn't real, was it? It was manufactured. You were encouraged to spend time with him, to build a relationship with him, while I was systematically cut out of his life. I walked to the window, looking out at the fields that stretched to the horizon. Do you know what hurts the most? It's not the money. It's not even the deception. It's the lost time. It's the conversations we never had, the memories we never made. It's knowing that he spent the last years of his life thinking I didn't care about him, while I spent those same years thinking he didn't care about me. What do you want us to say? Dad asked. and there was something defeated in his voice. "I want you to say that you're sorry," I said, turning back to face them. "I want you to acknowledge that what you did was wrong, that you hurt both Grandpa and me for your own selfish reasons. I want you to admit that you were more concerned with money than with love." "We're sorry," Mom said quickly. "We're so sorry, Claire. We never meant for it to go this far." "But you did mean for it to go somewhere," I said. "You meant for Vanessa to inherit everything. You meant for me to be left out. You just didn't count on Grandpa being smarter than all of you." I picked up my purse, suddenly exhausted by the whole situation. "I need to go. I need to think about all of this." "Claire, wait," Vanessa said, standing up. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to find out what the Whitman Research Annex is," I said. "I'm going to figure out what Grandpa left me, and why he thought it was important." The address on the deed led me to a property about 20 miles outside of town, down a winding road that seemed to lead nowhere. I almost missed the turnoff, marked only by a small sign that read Whitman Research Annex, private property. The driveway was gravel, lined with oak trees that formed a canopy overhead. At the end of the drive, I found a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood exactly what I needed. It was modern but not stark, with large windows that let in natural light and a design that seemed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. There was a small house attached to one side, and gardens that looked like they'd been planned by someone who understood both beauty and function. I used the key Mr. Keene had given me to unlock the front door, and stepped into a space that took my breath away. The main room was filled with equipment I recognized from my graduate work, but everything was newer, better, more sophisticated than anything I'd ever had access to. There were microscopes and centrifuges, computers and printers, shelves lined with books and journals that covered every aspect of agricultural and environmental science. But it was the smaller details that made me understand what this place really was. There was a desk in the corner that was exactly the right height for someone my size. There was a comfortable chair that looked like it had been chosen with long hours of reading in mind. There were plants everywhere, thriving in the careful balance of light and humidity that the building had been designed to maintain. On the desk, I found a folder with my name on it, filled with research proposals and grant applications that had been prepared but never submitted. Projects that built on the work I'd done in graduate school, ideas that pushed the boundaries of what I'd thought was possible. At the bottom of the folder was a note in Grandpa's handwriting. "For when you're ready to change the world." I sat down in that perfect chair and opened the first proposal, a study on sustainable farming practices that could help small communities become more self-sufficient. The research was solid, the methodology was sound, and the potential impact was enormous. It was work that mattered, work that could make a real difference in people's lives. For the first time in hours, I smiled. Not the polite, careful smile I'd been wearing all day, but a real smile, the kind that came from deep inside. This was what Grandpa had seen in me, what he'd been trying to nurture all along. Not just intelligence or curiosity, but the drive to use those qualities to help others. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the facility, discovering rooms I hadn't known existed, and equipment I'd only dreamed of having access to. There was a greenhouse for growing test plants, a lab for analyzing soil samples, a library filled with research that spanned decades of agricultural innovation, everything I needed to turn ideas into reality. As the sun began to set, I found myself back in the main room, looking through the windows at the gardens that would soon be mine to tend. I thought about the conversation at Dorothy's house, about the family I'd lost and the inheritance I'd gained. I thought about Grandpa and what he'd hoped I would do with this gift. I pulled out my phone and called the number on the first grant application. A woman answered, and I introduced myself as Walter Whitman's granddaughter, calling about a research proposal. She was excited to hear from me, she said. They'd been hoping I would get in touch. "Your grandfather spoke about you often," she said. "He was convinced that you were going to change the world. Are you ready to get started?" I looked around the lab, at the equipment that would let me test my theories, at the space where I could work without having to justify my existence to anyone. "Yes," I said. "I think I am." 3 months later, I was running the most successful independent agricultural research facility in the state. The projects Grandpa had outlined were even more ambitious than I'd initially realized, and the funding he'd secured was enough to support not just my work, but a team of researchers who shared my vision for sustainable farming practices. I'd hired 2 of my former classmates from graduate school, people who understood that science could be both rigorous and compassionate. We were working on drought-resistant crops for small farmers, developing soil restoration techniques that could help communities recover from years of industrial agriculture. The work was challenging and exhausting and absolutely perfect. Vanessa came to visit on a Tuesday afternoon in October, driving up the gravel road in a car I didn't recognize. She looked different than she had at Dorothy's house, less polished somehow, more uncertain. She stood in the doorway of the lab for a long moment, taking in the controlled chaos of ongoing experiments and the constant hum of equipment. "This is incredible," she said finally. "I had no idea what you were doing out here." I showed her around the facility, explaining the projects we were working on and the communities we were hoping to help. She asked thoughtful questions, and I found myself remembering the little girl who used to help me catch fireflies in the backyard, before we'd become strangers competing for attention. "I've been thinking about what happened," she said as we walked through the greenhouse. "About what Mom and Dad did, what I did. I keep trying to figure out how to apologize for something so big." "You don't have to apologize," I said. "You were just trying to be the daughter they wanted, the same way I was trying to be the daughter they wanted. Neither of us succeeded, but that's not our fault." "But I knew," she said quietly. "Maybe not all of it, but I knew that something wasn't right. I knew that Grandpa asked about you, and I knew that Mom and Dad always changed the subject. I should have said something. Maybe," I agreed, "but you were 22 years old, and you were being told that you were the favored grandchild. That's a hard thing to question when you're young and insecure." She stopped walking and turned to face me. "I wasn't insecure, though. That's what I've been trying to understand. I was confident. Maybe too confident. I thought I deserved everything I was getting. And now? Now I think I spent my whole life accepting praise I didn't earn and achievements I didn't deserve. I think I got so used to being the golden child that I forgot how to be a real person." We finished the tour in silence, and I walked her back to her car. She hesitated before getting in, like there was something else she wanted to say. "The $10 million, she said finally. "I've been trying to figure out what to do with it. It doesn't feel like mine anymore." "It is yours," I said. "Grandpa left it to you for a reason." "What reason?" "I don't know. Maybe because he thought you'd figure out how to use it wisely. Maybe because he believed you were capable of growth and change. Maybe because he loved you, even if he was disappointed in how you'd been raised." She nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation, something that supports young scientists, especially women in rural areas who don't have access to the same opportunities we did." "That sounds like something Grandpa would have supported," I said. "Would you help me?" she asked. "I don't know anything about running a foundation, but I know you understand what young scientists need." I thought about it for a moment, weighing the complications against the potential benefits. "I'd be willing to serve on the board," I said finally, "to help with the selection process for grants and fellowships." "Thank you," she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "I know I can't fix what happened, but maybe I can help make sure it doesn't happen to other people." After she left, I sat in the garden behind the main building, watching the sun set over the fields that were now mine to tend. I thought about the conversation we'd just had, about the possibility of rebuilding something that had been broken for so long. It wouldn't be easy, and it might not work, but for the first time in years, I felt like we might actually be sisters instead of strangers. Dorothy called that evening, as she did most nights now. We developed a routine of checking in with each other, sharing the small details of our days that had become precious to both of us. She was the grandmother I'd never had, and I was the granddaughter she'd never expected to find. "How did it go with Vanessa?" she asked, and I could hear the concern in her voice. "Better than I expected," I said. "She's trying to figure out how to use her inheritance for something meaningful." "Walter would be proud of both of you," Dorothy said. "He always believed that people could change, that they could grow beyond their circumstances if they were given the chance." "I miss him," I said, and it was the first time I'd admitted it out loud. "I miss him too," Dorothy said, "but I think he'd be happy with what you're building out there. I think he'd say that you took his gift and made it into something even better than he'd imagined." 5 years later, the Whitman Research Annex had become a model for sustainable agriculture research, with partnerships at universities across the country and projects that were helping farmers from Iowa to India. The work was exactly what I'd always dreamed of doing, combining rigorous science with practical applications that made real differences in people's lives. Vanessa's foundation had funded over 200 young scientists, providing grants and mentorship to women who were working on environmental and agricultural research in underserved communities. She'd thrown herself into the work with the same intensity she'd once brought to everything else, but this time the effort felt genuine rather than performative. We still weren't close the way some sisters were, but we'd found a way to work together that honored both our strengths and our differences. She understood funding and administration, the business side of making change happen. I understood the science, the research that would determine whether our efforts actually mattered. Together, we'd created something that neither of us could have built alone. Mom and Dad had tried to reconcile with me several times over the years, sending letters and making phone calls that I sometimes answered and sometimes didn't. The conversations were awkward and careful, full of the kind of politeness that people use when they're trying to rebuild something that was never quite right to begin with. I didn't hate them, but I didn't trust them either, and we all seemed to understand that some kinds of damage couldn't be completely repaired. The hardest part wasn't forgiving them for what they'd done to me. The hardest part was forgiving them for what they'd stolen from Grandpa, for the years of loneliness they'd imposed on a man who'd only wanted to love his granddaughter. That was the wound that still ached sometimes, when I thought about all the conversations we'd never had and all the memories we'd never made. But Dorothy had helped me understand that grief could coexist with gratitude, that I could mourn what I'd lost while still celebrating what I'd found. The research facility was more than just a laboratory or a workspace. It was proof that love could survive deception, that legacy could triumph over greed, that the best gifts were the ones that grew larger when they were shared with others. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the lab was empty, I sometimes walked out to the garden where I'd planted a small memorial for Grandpa. It was just a bench under an oak tree, with a plaque that read Walter R. Whitman, scientist, teacher, believer in questions. I'd sit there and tell him about the day's experiments, about the students we were mentoring, about the communities we were helping. I'd tell him about the drought-resistant wheat varieties that were helping farmers in Kenya maintain their yields despite changing rainfall patterns. I'd tell him about the soil restoration project in Nebraska that was bringing life back to land that had been considered beyond saving. I'd tell him about the young woman from rural Mississippi who'd just received her doctorate in environmental science with funding from Vanessa's foundation. Most of all, I'd tell him that I finally understood what he'd been trying to teach me all along, that the real inheritance wasn't money or property or even scientific equipment. It was the understanding that curiosity and compassion could change the world, but only if you had the courage to ask the questions that mattered and the persistence to keep searching for answers even when the work was hard. The $10 million that Vanessa had inherited was substantial, impressive, the kind of sum that made headlines and inspired envy. But it was finite, bounded by the limits of what money could accomplish on its own. The mission that Grandpa had left me was different. It was renewable, generative, the kind of gift that grew stronger every time it was shared with someone else. He'd left her $10 million because that's what she could handle at the time, because that's what would challenge her to grow beyond the limitations that had been placed on her by parents who'd valued performance over authenticity. He'd left me a mission because he'd seen something in me that I was only beginning to understand myself, a capacity for work that mattered more than the rewards it might bring. Money runs out, gets spent, or invested, or given away until it's gone. But missions multiply, creating ripple effects that spread far beyond their original scope. Every student we trained would go on to train others. Every problem we solved would inspire new questions. Every community we helped would become stronger, more resilient, better equipped to face whatever challenges came next. As I sat in that garden, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, I thought about the girl I'd been at 10 years old, clutching a science fair trophy and wondering why no one seemed to care about the questions that fascinated her. I thought about the young woman I'd been at 25, sitting in a lawyer's office and learning that her family's love had conditions she'd never been told about. And I thought about the woman I was now, surrounded by work that mattered and people who understood that science could be both rigorous and compassionate. I thought about the lab where young researchers were asking new questions and finding new answers. I thought about the fields where better crops were growing, the communities where families were building more sustainable lives. This was what Grandpa had seen when he'd looked at me. Not just the girl who asked too many questions, but the woman who would never stop asking them. Not just the granddaughter who felt invisible, but the scientist who would spend her life making the invisible visible, the overlooked important, the impossible achievable. He'd left her $10 million. He'd left me a mission. And that, truly, was the real inheritance. The gift that would keep giving long after all of us were gone. The legacy that would outlive bank accounts and stock portfolios and everything else that people usually thought of as wealth. In the end, I understood that love wasn't just about what you gave to someone. It was about what you helped them become, what you made possible for them to achieve. Grandpa had loved Vanessa enough to give her the tools to become better than she'd been raised to be. He'd loved me enough to give me the space to become everything I'd been afraid to hope I could be. The mission continues. The questions multiply. The work grows larger and more important with every passing year. And somewhere, in the space between earth and sky where the people we've loved go when they leave us, I like to think that Walter R. Whitman is watching and smiling, proud of the granddaughters who learned to see past the money to the meaning, past the inheritance to the legacy, past the gift to the responsibility that came with it. That was the real inheritance, not what he left us, but what he taught us to build with what we'd been given, and that gift, unlike money, would never run out.